The envelope wasn't supposed to be mine. That's what the neighbor upstairs said when I knocked on her door, holding the heavy, cream-colored packet that had been slipped under my doormat. Delivery guy must have mixed it up again, she shrugged. But the name on the label chilled me. My name was there, printed neatly, but directly underneath it, his name sat in bold letters. Michael Foster. My ex-stepfather. The man I'd tried for years to untangle from my life was suddenly staring back at me, literally anchored to my new foundation. I ripped the packet open on the kitchen counter, surrounded by unopened moving boxes and the smell of recently painted walls. Inside was a thick, notarized letter, a copy of my lease, stamped and official. Except under signatures, right next to mine, was his. Not just as a reference or an emergency contact, but as co-lessee, guarantor, and conditional overseer. There were handwritten notes attached. Tenant must maintain financial counseling check-ins via guarantor. Guarantor. That meant him. The landlord's office had framed him as some kind of safety net on my behalf, without ever asking me if I still wanted him there. For a few seconds, I just stared. This couldn't be real. I'd applied for this place myself, filled out all the forms, paid the deposit with my own money. I had told everyone, even my mother, that this was my clean break. But seeing his name on the same sheet where I'd signed my freedom felt like a gut punch. My chest constricted like I was back under his roof, 19 again, begging to be allowed to attend a late class without a lecture on responsibility. I kept pacing the apartment, lease in hand, reading the sentences again and again. Tenant shall provide proof of employment updates to guarantor. Proof of employment? To him? Who even writes conditions like that into a basic rental lease? It was more than legality. It was a leash disguised as protection. I tried calling the leasing office immediately, but it was already past 6. A voicemail box that didn't take new messages was all I got. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the apartment felt different, as if he already had keys in his pocket, as if the walls weren't mine. Here's the part you need to understand. I didn't just hate the mistake. I hated that it felt like déjà vu. Michael had always found ways to stay tied to me under the banner of help. And now, in this place I chose for myself, his name was literally stapled to mine in black ink. I promised myself I'd get answers in the morning, but a sick thought already formed. What if it wasn't a mistake? What if he meant for this to happen, down to the fine print? Shall I write the next chapter? The next morning, I woke up with a lease still spread across the coffee table, coffee rings darkening the edges of the paper where my nerves had made me spill. I barely registered the taste of my own cup as I scrolled through my phone looking for proof. Emails, application confirmations, anything that could remind me that I had applied and signed for this place by myself. But there it was again. Each document attached with his digital signature already embedded. It didn't make sense. I hadn't asked him to co-sign. And then it hit me. Maybe he still had hold of credit references left over from years ago, when I was at university, and Mom had begged him to help me get housing in student residences. Back then, I thought he was doing me a favor. In reality, he'd planted his name exactly where it would resurface later. In the systems, in the records, in the landlord files. You need to understand why I couldn't just pack up and go somewhere else. This wasn't a dreamy loft. It was my first stable place after years of couch surfing, temporary sublets, and broken student leases. I had saved for 6 months working extra shifts to build the deposit. I picked the location carefully, close to work, far from the neighborhood where he and my mom still lived. Leaving wasn't just inconvenient. It would be catastrophic for my finances and my pride. I sat on the floor of the half-unpacked living room, my boxes stacked like barricades around me, and thought about what this lease tied me to. If his name was officially there, then legally he had rights. Access rights, notification rights. It meant he would know if I missed rent, if mail got sent, maybe even if repair visits were scheduled. I suddenly pictured him standing in the lobby, chatting with the property manager, smirking like he always did whenever he found out something about my life I hadn't invited him into. Pride mixed with fear. I didn't want to seem weak, but deep down the thought pulsed. What if he orchestrated this not for money, but to keep me dependent? To make sure every move I made would still revolve around him somehow. That was always his way. Wrap control in a gift box labeled support. I told myself I'd wait for the leasing office to open, get clarity, straighten it out. But my phone buzzed before 9 a.m. A text from Mom. Just one line. "Michael said he helped you with the lease. You should say thank you." My stomach dropped. That single sentence told me it wasn't an error. He hadn't stumbled into the paperwork accidentally. He'd already bragged about it. He was planting seeds in my mother's ear before I even had a chance to fight back. And that was when I realized the stakes weren't just financial. If I didn't move carefully, my own mother would take his side again. Shall I write the next chapter? When Mom's message lit up my phone, I sat frozen on the couch, clutching it like it might burn straight through my palm. Say thank you. The words throbbed in my mind with that familiar sting, as if gratitude was the only currency acceptable in this family, no matter what the cost. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, but instead, I stared at my half-assembled IKEA shelf and thought about all the other moments when little thank yous had been forced out of me to cover for Michael's control. By noon, boxes were still scattered everywhere, mocking the idea that I was moved in. I couldn't unpack because I didn't feel like this space belonged to me anymore. As if confirming my unease, the buzzer shrieked. I opened the door, and there he was. Michael himself, standing with that maddening smile, holding a reusable grocery bag. "I figured you wouldn't have had time for shopping yet," he said, brushing past me into the apartment without waiting for invitation. My breath caught. He knew the buzz code. Already. He walked slow, surveying the space like he was inspecting an investment property. He murmured, touching the edge of a counter. "These landlords always cheap out on finishes. Don't install anything heavy on these walls. They'll crumble. Maybe better if I hold the spare key until you're settled." I swear my chest rattled with rage. A spare key? He was assuming rights that weren't his, presenting them as fatherly wisdom. I held my ground, but my words snagged between my teeth. On the surface, everything he did could be excused as helpful. To my neighbors, who poked curious heads out into the hallway to peek at who had entered my new place, he must have looked like a kind older man guiding a young woman through her first apartment. But I knew. He was already laying seeds of presence, tiny intrusions disguised as kindness. Just like when I was a teenager and he'd check my homework, then mark my papers in red even though he wasn't my teacher. Just like when he'd buy me clothes for school but remove the tags so I had to depend on him, never returning anything to the store myself. I snapped out of it when he set the bag down loudly on the counter. "Got you milk and bread." "Oh, and I talked with the manager downstairs. I reassured him you'd be fine with me overseeing things." He said it proudly, as though it were natural. My hands trembled, hidden behind my back. To anyone else, he'd sound reasonable. But wasn't that always how he worked? Reasonableness on the surface, shackles in disguise. As he left, he gave my shoulder a quick fatherly tap. "I'll swing by with the spare key copy tomorrow, don't worry." He walked down the hall just as my neighbor, Mrs. Lee from 4B, passed him. She smiled respectfully at him, then looked at me and said warmly, "It's so nice you have someone looking out for you here." That was the moment my stomach flipped. He wasn't just invading my lease. He was already rewriting the story of my independence to everyone else around me. And I knew, if I didn't fight this now, He'd make sure I never looked like I could stand on my own. Shall I write the next chapter? By the time Michael left that first day, his cologne lingered in the entryway like an uninvited guest. I opened all the windows, but the air still felt contaminated. I kept repeating the neighbor's words in my head. It's so nice you have someone looking out for you. No matter how many times I replayed it, my chest clenched tighter. Looking out for me wasn't what this was. It never had been. But everyone else always believed it. When I finally reached the leasing office the next morning, I braced myself. The receptionist recognized me instantly and shuffled through a folder. "Yes, we've got you as primary tenant and Mr. Foster as guarantor," she said in a sing-song, like she was telling me my favorite dessert was already ready. "I didn't list him. I didn't authorize that. How is his name even in your system?" My voice cracked sharper than I wanted. People in the waiting area turned to look, and I hated that I sounded panicked instead of composed. She smiled thin like I was an overexcited child. "It's the application portal. His information populated automatically from prior records. It shows a strong guarantor history. Honestly, it helps new tenants qualify. Someone must have submitted it along with yours. Someone, and we both knew who." I tried again. "Then remove him. I'll put up the security deposit double if I need to." Her face fell into the kind of trained customer service frown that really means no. For amendments, both tenant and guarantor have to submit signed forms. Otherwise, the contract stands. I walked out burning from inside, nails pressing half moons into my palms. On the sidewalk, I texted Mom against my better judgment. "Did you give Michael my documents?" She wrote back within minutes. "He just wanted you to get approved. Why are you always looking for enemies?" That line lodged in me like a thorn. The oldest game in Michael's playbook was gaslighting me as paranoid, dramatic, ungrateful. Now he was running the same move through her. That evening, his intrusion deepened. I came home from work to find an envelope slipped neatly under my door. Inside was a typed sheet with little bullet points. Cleaning schedule, payment reminders, a note at the bottom. Proof of employment due on the 1st. Please don't slack. No signature, but who else could it be? Sitting cross-legged on the floor, I held the list while an icy numbness crept up my back. It wasn't just a lease anymore. He was recasting our old dynamic, page by page. Rule provider, me, the child. And that's when I realized, if I didn't push back now, he would monopolize not just my living arrangement, but my story. To the landlord, to my neighbors, even to my own mother, he'd be the selfless protector. I'd be the reckless one who needed him. But the question was, how do you fight someone who's already framing the whole narrative before you can even speak? Shall I write the next chapter? I knew what was happening the moment it unfolded, because it was the same chessboard he'd always set up. He moved first, shaping appearances, leaving me cornered before I even realized we were in a game. But this time, it wasn't behind closed doors. It was public. Saturday morning, I stepped out into the hallway with a bag of recycling, still tired-eyed from a late shift. A couple from my floor was talking near the elevator, and Michael's voice thundered between them before I even saw him. He was standing there in my building's lobby, holding court with neighbors like he was the landlord himself. "Yeah, she's doing okay," he was saying, loud enough for every ear within 20 feet to catch it. "Rough start, you know how young people are, but it's good she's got me handling the finances. I told the manager I'd make sure she never falls behind." The air dropped out of me. The couple smiled politely at him and glanced up as I approached. They looked at me with that soft pity you give a child who can't quite manage. I wanted to scream, but my throat locked. "Hey, kiddo," Michael called, voice booming. He loved performing that affectionate authority. "I was just telling them I'm covering your rent for a bit until you find your footing." I froze in the hallway, recycling bag cutting into my palm. That wasn't true. Not one single cent had come from him. I drained my own savings for this apartment. But there it was. A lie salted into the air, already shaping how people saw me. The couple chuckled, said something like, "You're lucky to have family who steps up," and slipped inside their unit. I looked at their door for too long, like maybe it would open again and someone would see me, really see me. I turned to him. "You don't get to say that." My voice shook, nearly whispering. "I pay for this. Me." He leaned in with that infuriating smile, his breath sharp like coffee. "You don't understand, honey. People respect you more when they think you have backing. You don't want them thinking you're barely scraping by, do you?" There it was, the gaslight framed as a kindness. My truth rewritten into his narrative, me shoved into the role of helpless protege. And the worst part? It worked. To the neighbors who only overheard his side, I'd forever be the girl who couldn't make it on her own. I carried my recycling down to the chute, but my vision blurred with rage. If I let him, he'd smother every shred of independence I'd carved out with conditions, illusions, staged conversations. And yet, that very afternoon, another problem emerged. When I went to the leasing office with my pay stubs in hand, ready to prove myself, the manager gave me a cautious smile and said, "Your guarantor already dropped off documentation this morning. You don't need to double-check anything." My jaw ached as I forced words out. "I am the tenant. He is not my financial overseer. I want his name removed." The manager hesitated. "We can't without his cooperation." By the time I walked back to my apartment, shoulders throbbing from how tightly I held myself, I realized what Michael was doing. He wasn't just stringing my mother along anymore. He was staging a performance on every front. The landlord, the neighbors, even strangers in the hallway. And unless I found a way to unravel his story with proof, I would live as a supporting character in my own damn life. The question was, where would I even find enough evidence to break his facade? Shall I write the next chapter? That night, I pulled every old file box I'd kept from my college years out of the closet. Dust caked my hands, but I didn't care. I needed to know if my paranoia had roots, if Michael had been planting these traps all along. By midnight, the living room floor was covered in half-torn binders, stapled forms, tuition receipts, housing agreements from years back. It was like digging shallow graves. And then, tucked inside a plastic sleeve with old printouts, I found it. An email chain, not even on my account, but a carbon copy on a housing form he'd once filled out. It was between Michael and a property manager from my student residence back in sophomore year. His words were painted in black pixels as cold as stone. "I prefer my name remain attached to her records, future applications too, just in case she ever tries to act on her own. It gives some leverage." There it was. Not generosity, not parental concern. Proof, in writing, that his master plan was control. The word leverage burned into my skull. How many decisions in my life had been bent, not by my mistakes, but by paperwork threads he knotted years before. I thought about showing Mom right then, but then the old dread crept in. Whenever I'd confronted her with something clear, she'd always said, "You're exaggerating. Michael only wants what's best for you." Would she even read his words without twisting them into another act of sacrifice? Still, I tucked the printed proof into an envelope and set it on my counter. Holding it in my hands steadied me. It was like carrying a live weapon. Finally, I had something sharper than his charm. The next day, though, he escalated again before I could move. A glossy flyer had been slipped under my door, addressed to tenants and their families. It advertised a community meet and greet that very evening, hosted in the shared lobby. And right at the bottom, under coordinator, Michael Foster. My blood prickled in disbelief. He wasn't just freeloading his name on my lease. He was inserting himself into the identity of the building, hosting events, introducing himself as if he was part owner. Neighbors gathered that evening. I stood in the circle, arms folded, watching him shake hands and laugh. My daughter, well, stepdaughter technically, but I think of her as my own, just moved in here. I wanted to do something so she'd be welcomed. Laughter, smiles, murmurs of admiration. Nobody heard what I heard. A man tightening a net around my voice, stealing my narrative in front of strangers. I squeezed the envelope in my hand, the one containing his incriminating words. My heart pounded with a question I couldn't shake. Did I dare explode his facade in front of these people, here and now? Or would I once again be labeled dramatic, unstable, ungrateful? For the first time, though, I realized silence was a choice too. And maybe it was the very silence he counted on most. Shall I write the next chapter? I stood in that lobby with the envelope hidden in my tote, watching him work the room as if he belonged to it more than any of us. He laughed loudly, filled every pause with anecdotes about responsibility and co-signing for family. Every nod and smile from a neighbor pressed heavier on my shoulders. It was as if my independence was being erased minute by minute, written over by his false generosity. But I didn't pull out the proof. Not that night. My throat ached with a scream I couldn't release, because I knew how it would play out. If I interrupted, I'd look hysterical. If I showed words from years ago, he'd say I'd misunderstood them. And if neighbors saw me snapping at the man who brought cookies and balloons for their kids at his so-called welcoming party, they'd believe the version of me he was curating, the bitter, ungrateful child. So I retreated to my apartment early, locking the door behind me, pressing my back hard against it. As I slid down to the floor, the weight of the envelope dug into my leg like sharp metal. Proof doesn't mean anything if people refuse to see it. That night, I dreamt of being 14 again, trapped in my room while my mom laughed at his jokes out in the living room, her voice singing along to the tune of his Control. I woke in tears, every nerve ending buzzing with one truth. Reasoning wasn't going to free me. He had weaponized appearances, and appearances were stronger than facts when left unchallenged. The breaking point came 2 days later. I returned from work to find a note taped on my door in his slanted, officious handwriting, "Maintenance coming Tuesday. I'll be here to let them in if you're busy." I yanked the paper down so hard it ripped, fists trembling. It wasn't just control, it was invasion. He was planning on being inside my apartment without me. My home, my walls, my bed, my private space bought with my shifts and my savings. I tore through my tote to find the envelope with the incriminating printouts. My hands shook less as I held them now, because the choice had solidified inside me. No more playing along politely. No more letting him script me into helplessness. By the time I fell asleep that night, I'd already scheduled a meeting with the property manager. And this time, Mom was going to be there too. If Michael wanted to control the narrative, then fine. I'd drag him into a room with the very people he used to perform his lies. Let's see how well he spins when the evidence stares him down on the table. I didn't know what fallout would come, but I knew this much. I couldn't live in a cage built out of his help. The question was no longer if I'd risk the confrontation, but how much I was willing to lose to cut the final tie. Shall I write the next chapter? The day of the meeting, I arrived early at the leasing office, my hands clammy around the manila envelope. The waiting area smelled of copier toner and stale coffee, and I perched on the edge of a plastic chair like I was in court. In a way, I was. When Mom walked in behind Michael, my pulse nearly jumped out of my neck. She looked nervous, clasping her purse tightly, while he strode in with easy confidence, smiling as if he'd been invited to receive an award. He greeted the property manager with a booming, Glad we could make this official, always happy to help keep her stable. The property manager motioned us into a glass-walled conference room. The sound of shuffling papers seemed louder than usual, amplifying the tension. Michael leaned back with his hands folded, giving me that patronizing half-smile, like this whole thing was just another tantrum I was throwing. "So," he said smoothly, "what's the confusion today?" My voice almost broke, but I forced it steady. "The confusion," I said, sliding the envelope across the table, "is that you've been pretending this is for my benefit, when it never was. You've been orchestrating this since college." He arched an eyebrow, chuckling under his breath, until the property manager pulled out the copies, his eyes scanning. The email chain spoke for itself. Leverage. Just in case she ever tries to act on her own. Michael's smile faltered. He tried to laugh it off, gesturing broadly. "Old emails, out of context. Everyone says things." "No one says things like that unless they mean them," I cut in, louder than I intended. "You wanted control, not protection. You wanted me tied to you so you could parade around like this." I gestured to the manager, my mother, the damn building outside these glass walls. "Like I can't breathe without you." Silence fell, thick and brittle. The property manager cleared his throat. "Mr. Foster, given this, I'll need to review whether your continued presence on this lease is appropriate. If Ms. Reynolds is prepared to provide her own security deposit, we can rewrite without a guarantor." Michael's face turned red, a sharp contrast against his polished shirt collar. He sputtered, "I've invested my time. I've invested my—" "You've invested in appearances," I snapped. I turned to Mom, who sat wide-eyed, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "He didn't want to protect me, Mom. He wanted proof to everyone else that I needed him. That's not love." For once, she didn't rush to defend him. She just looked away, shoulders trembling, as if decades of practiced denial were cracking all at once. The property manager slid the paperwork toward me. "You'll have to cover an additional deposit, yes, but it's your choice." I signed before the pen cooled on the paper, heart hammering, Michael's glare cutting into me like knives. He shoved back his chair with violent force, muttering, "You'll regret this," before storming out of the office. But for the first time in years, I felt the ground beneath me shift in my favor. The question that haunted me now was, when the dust settled, would my mother finally see whose side she'd been standing on all these years? Or would she walk right back into his shadow? Shall I write the next chapter? Mom didn't leave with him. That was the first shock. But she didn't stay seated either. She just stood in the doorway of the leasing office, torn open, like somebody had pulled a rug from beneath her feet and left her clinging to nothing. Her eyes, that combination of disbelief and shame, were locked not on me, but on the papers in the property manager's hands. The proof. "Mom," I whispered after Michael's storm of perfume and footsteps disappeared. "He told you it was for my good. Look, please, look at what he actually said." I slid the email copies toward her again. My fingers shook, but my voice steadied. I had to hold the moment before it, too, slipped out of my grasp. She picked up the pages like they might bite her. Her lips moved silently as she read. "I prefer my name remain attached. Leverage." The words seemed to lodge in her throat. For years, she had defended him, softened him, painted every jagged edge as support. Watching her read his raw words stole the air from the room. Finally, she sank into the chair across from me. Her voice splintered. He said you'd never get approved without him. He made me believe." She stopped herself, folding the page. "I wanted to think he was protecting you, because if I admitted the truth—" Her hands trembled, pounding the folder against her knee. "I'd have to admit, I let him do this to you all along." I didn't move closer. I didn't soothe her. For once, I let the silence hang heavy. because she needed to feel the weight of it without me cushioning the fall. The property manager excused himself to get the new paperwork, and for a few rare seconds, it was just me and her. No Michael in the middle. She leaned over the table, eyes rimmed red. "Do you know how hard it is for me to see him, without the gloss, without the stories?" he told me. "He was my husband for so long. I wanted to believe." My jaw clenched hard. "You chose to believe, and every time you did, I paid the price." Her face broke, but I didn't flinch. This wasn't about cruelty. It was about truth finally being spoken out loud. When the property manager returned with my clean lease, I signed again. This time, my name stood alone. And when the pen left the paper, I felt something loosen in my spine, like a cord I hadn't realized was wound so tight had finally been cut. Michael's glare, his booming staged acts, his support wrapped in shackles, none of it had the same hold anymore. Legally, officially, in black ink, I wasn't tethered to him. The fallout came fast, though. By the time Mom and I stepped outside, my phone buzzed with his texts. Long, spiraling paragraphs about betrayal, selfishness. How could you humiliate me like that? His threats grew sharper with each message, pulling connections, telling family I was unstable, blaming me for ruining Mom's reputation. Freedom had cost me his rage, bare and unmasked. The question was how far he'd go now that his power over me wasn't stamped on a lease, but festering in his bruised ego. Shall I write the next chapter? The texts didn't stop all night. They came in clusters. First, the patronizing ones. "You'll see, in a month when bills pile up, you'll come crawling back and thank me." Then the guilt trips. "After everything I did for you, this is how you repay me?" And finally, what I'd always feared most, the threats. "If your employer knew how irresponsible you really are, I doubt they'd keep you. Do you want me to let them know?" I didn't answer, just stared at the screen until my eyes burned. But inside, my stomach curdled. This was the part most people never understood about him. You think he's just pushy, maybe arrogant until you push back. Then his mask comes off and you see the claws. By morning, my mother was calling nonstop. I ignored her at first, but eventually fatigue cracked me. She launched right in, her voice fractured. "He's furious. He says he'll tell everyone you're an addict, that you're unstable." I tried to calm him, but, "Honey, maybe you could have handled it quieter? Maybe not so public?" I almost laughed at the irony. Public was the only language he understood. For years, behind closed doors, my voice wasn't enough. But the moment everyone else heard, his empire shook. And now Mom wanted quieter. "Mom," I said, flat and tired, "he won't stop until I have nothing to my name. You see that, right?" There was silence on her end. Whether it was dawning comprehension or just old fear, I couldn't tell. Later that week, the fallout spread. 2 cousins texted me out of nowhere. "What's this about you turning on Michael? He only ever helped." Another neighbor gave me a sympathetic smile in the elevator, saying she hoped whatever tension with your dad sorted itself out soon. The word dad made my throat close. He had spun the narrative so deep that even strangers in my building thought he was my guardian angel. But that night, something shifted. I sat down at my desk with the pile of documents, his emails, the lists he'd left, the texts that turned from sweet to venom in one thread. I printed every single one. Then I went further. I wrote a clear timeline, when he inserted himself, how he leveraged Mom, how he painted himself as necessary. A story that wasn't just in my head anymore, but written, undeniable, on paper. I wasn't just preparing to defend myself. I was preparing to expose him. To family. To anyone who questioned. Maybe even legally if it came to that. Cutting his name off the lease freed me on paper. but if I didn't strip away his narrative, he'd still own my shadow. For the first time, I knew exactly what had to come next. No more private battles. The confrontation wasn't over. It was only moving to a bigger stage. And this time, the story would be mine to tell. Shall I write the next chapter? I didn't have to wait long for the bigger stage. Michael set it up himself. The following Sunday, my mother begged me to come to dinner. "Just family," she said. "We can talk in peace." I was cautious, but curiosity won. When I walked into her dining room, the smell of roast beef and rosemary hung in the air. Familiar, homey. But the moment I saw Michael at the head of the table, glass of wine in hand, I knew it wasn't just dinner. He stood as though conducting a performance. "Well, look who finally decided to join us. We were just talking about you." Around the table were two of my aunts, a cousin, even some family friends, faces he had carefully chosen as his audience. I felt Mom's hand brush mine nervously, like a silent plea. Don't make a scene. But wasn't that the whole point for him? To control the scene, to cast me as the disgruntled child while he played magnanimous patriarch. We sat. He launched right in. "I guess you all have heard some nonsense about me meddling in her affairs." Complete exaggerations. He grinned down the table as though I were a rumor to be chuckled at, not a person. The truth is, she couldn't have gotten that lease without me. Poor credit, unstable hours. You know how it is at that age. I did what a responsible father figure does. The nods around the table stabbed into me like tiny knives. That was always his strength, getting them on his side before I opened my mouth. Mom stared at her plate. But I had my folder this time. I had rehearsed the moment in my head, the rattle in my nerves replaced by something colder. I took a deep breath, unzipped it, and spread the pages like cards in a poker game. "Read this," I said, sliding one toward my aunt. The old email, the one where he wrote about keeping leverage. Then the neatly typed bullet point list he left me. Employment proof, rules, all signed with his smug deference. Finally, the text thread from days earlier, his words dripping with threats. Voices around the table wavered as papers passed from hand to hand. Silence fell thick, except for the ticking of the wall clock. My cousin shifted uncomfortably. My aunt's face stiffened. Michael tried to snatch the papers back. Out of context, ancient messages. Context? My voice cracked through the room. You told a property manager you wanted leverage over me, and you lied to neighbors saying you paid my rent. That's not support, it's control. I looked around the table, daring them. If any of you want to think he's a saint, fine, but not at the expense of my name, my independence, or my truth. Michael's face hardened, the smirk gone, a flush creeping up his neck. He muttered something about ingratitude and pushed back from the table. But the audience he relied on didn't clap this time. Eyes followed the papers in their hands, not him. Even Mom raised her head, tears on her cheeks, meeting mine instead of his. And in the silence that followed his retreat from the room, a new question formed. What happens when the mask finally breaks in front of everyone, and the man who fed on reputation has nothing left to hide behind? Shall I write the next chapter?